Hello, everybody. My name is Dovilė Budrytė, and I'm the current president of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our webinar, Imagining Postwar Ukraine and its Place in Europe. And it's the fourth webinar in the series since February 2022. This roundtable brings together scholars from Ukraine and the Baltic states to discuss the current state of the war in Ukraine, as well as to imagine the future of the country and the challenges and opportunities the post-war period will bring for Ukraine and Ukrainians. What pressing issues will Ukraine have to address after the war? What will post-war justice look like? What are these developments important for the Baltic states? Why are these developments important for the Baltic states? These and other questions will be tackled by our roundtable participants. Yuliya Bidenko, Associate Professor and Guarantor in the Master's Program Global Studies and World Politics at the Karazin Kharkiv National University in the Political Science Department. Daunis Kuzmin, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for International Studies and Assistant Professor at the Department of International Relations, School of International Relations, Political Science and Sociology from Odesa Mechnikov National University. Also joining us is Piret Ehin, Professor of Comparative Politics and Deputy Head for Research at the Johan Skytte Institute of Political Studies at Tartu University in Estonia. And this webinar will be moderated by Daunis Auers, Professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Latvia, and Director at Large at the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. So without any further delay, I'm going to ask Daunis to take over and once again, welcome everybody to this very interesting event.
Thank you, Dovilė, for your introductory words. So without further ado, we're going to go straight into our panel discussion. We don't have so much time after all. We have 56 minutes remaining of our time. We're going to have a few rounds of questions from me to the panelists to kick off our discussion. And then the second half of our hour, we want to move on to a question and answer session. So please submit any questions you might have. They can be directed towards all the panelists, or they can be directed towards a concrete panelist to maybe elaborate on something they've said at the start. But please send in your questions now. Now, Yuliya, I will turn to you first. I'd like you in your opening remarks to perhaps reflect not just on the war, but also on the non-military aspects of the war, because we, outside of Ukraine, we hear quite a lot about the war. We read about it in our newspapers, we see it on television, but there is less sort of information about civil society, about volunteering, also about other reforms that Ukraine's perhaps overtaken under the last year to bolster resistance. So perhaps you could speak to these issues as well as the war. So Yuliya, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor to be here with you. And actually, thank you for this question, because I would say that Ukrainian resilience and resistance was kind of surprise for many even friends of Ukraine, not talking about Ukrainian enemies. So I would say that civil society here made a great input, because we know already from the different, I would say, practices that are sharing via social media, or even based on sociological surveys, that more than 20% of Ukrainians, they are volunteering at the moment on a constant base, and more than 60% of Ukrainians, they have this experience of donating the money for Ukrainian armed forces and other part of Ukrainians, they also actively try to help internally displaced people, try to help humanitarian organization with addressing these humanitarian issues. And actually, it was it was nothing new in there, because I would say that comparatively to other states of, let's say, post-Soviet space, I don't like the term, but still, according to civil society organization's sustainability index, Ukraine have already the most developed civil society, which enjoyed pretty liberal legislation and was very powerful driver of reforms already implemented. And this set of reform couldn't be limited by I would say one or two, but I would like to name that decentralization reform was kind of a most significant and broadly known reform, which created this resilience in communities, because people were involved in policy making there. They have a pretty high level of trust to local councils and mayors, and they feel themselves that actually they belong into community, and they don't want any Russia occupants there. So that is why these examples of resilience, which was demonstrated by Kherson, by set of communities in my home region in Kharkiv, and actually the Kharkiv city itself, it shows us that people belong not only to national or political nation community, but also feel themselves being included in this resistance on ground. And other reforms which I would mention here is digitalization steps made by government, which created kind of a culture of media literacy, and also the availability of public services, and that is why people will appreciate that. And these digital instruments, they allow to cope with the problems of displacement much more faster than it was, for example, in 2014 or 2015, when Ukraine faced the first, I would say, steps from Russia occupying Crimea and launching the military missions in Donbass, because these humanitarian problems also were, and I would say homework was done during these 8 years by Ukrainian local and national government.
And Yuliya, how is the feeling in Ukraine, in your part of Ukraine? I mean, soon it will be a year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How is the resilience of people, of civil society after this, I suppose, fortunately, relatively mild winter as it comes to an end? But how are people feeling after this first year?
Well, I'm not in Kharkiv at the moment, but still a lot of my friends volunteer in there. And I have experience of being like a public expert myself, and be in touch with the numerous initiatives which appeared immediately in Kharkiv. And actually, there are some figures and numbers which could be vocal. For example, you can check via the United Nations humanitarian response site. You can see that actually Kharkiv, Dnipro, and probably Lviv, they have the highest amount of national-based NGO which are cooperating with the international humanitarian missions, which is very significant and vocal, because mostly in previous conflicts, United Nations cooperating with international missions, embassies, and so on and so forth, and that is kind of a sign of resilience. My mom and part of my colleagues and students, they are still in Kharkiv, and for example, they haven't any power, any electricity for 9 hours for just today. And actually now we have our session and exams with the part-time students, and half of the group couldn't join any Zoom lectures, unfortunately. But we try to be, very sensitive and very, I would say, student-oriented here, and we try to develop a lot of new instruments of education. I just want to remind that Ukraine didn't interrupt the educational processes on many levels of education. So it's really kind of small practices or small examples of to be hero during the day, during your everyday lives.
Thank you, Yuliya. And now, Daunis, I turn to you. How does the war look from the perspective of Odesa? And also, how do you, as an expert in these issues, I mean, how do you see the potential of European Union membership for Ukraine? I mean, I think in Ukraine, at least, there's still some discussion about the potential of NATO membership. And perhaps more broadly, how do you see the war impacting European integration across the region, with a particular perspective on Ukraine, of course?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm in Odesa now. As you can see, it's not really stable internet, but I really hope that it will work well. That's in 5 minutes, it's a so broad question to describe, definitely. And I would say from different perspectives. First of all, as a person from Odesa, who live in Odesa for many generations, I would say that this war affects us a lot because Odesa was always the city who votes for, if I'm sorry to say, who votes for Yanukovych, for Party of Region, for many pro-Russian movements, including Communist Party of Ukraine, not so high percentage as Donbass and Crimea, but always in the mind of Russian propaganda. Odesa was so-called pro-Russian region, which was not really truth, but now situation is definitely changed dramatically. I would say first time from 1991. So there was a couple waves of understanding people around me, understanding themselves as a Ukrainian, Ukrainian citizens, first of all, not ethnically, obviously, but as Ukrainians, as persons who have a patriotic passions to their state, like multicultural European state. And finally, through the waves, 1991, then Orange Revolution, 2004, then 2014. And only after this war, I would say that majority of population of my city are absolutely pro-Ukrainian in a European sense of this understanding. That makes me really happy. Even unfortunately, we need this war to have these changes. And the same situation is with the NATO and the EU perspective. So from one hand, all these documents are more or less the same. So war cannot change the procedure of EU enlargement as itself, totally. And of course, NATO memberships as well. And Ukraine talking about these two perspectives inside our country for many, many years. Even it's still sometimes surprise for someone in Western Europe, not in Baltic states, not in Eastern Europe, but we talk about this for decades. Yeah, so it starts from the end of 90s and different was situation. So I just have to remind that all this Maidan and Revolution of Dignity was start with so-called Euromaidan, which was pushed by the unexpected decision of former President Yanukovych not to sign the association agreement in Vilnius summit 2014, which is still kind of a pretty strange question. Probably future historians would find the real truth, what has happened in this situation, because I'm sure interviewing many people who works in and still works in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was on this summit, and I'm sure that even our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was with Yanukovych, he didn't know that till the last moment, till the press conference. Can you imagine? So That was kind of a strange situation. So now in this huge association agreement, there is no so-called membership perspective. That was a very strict demand from European Commission to cut the word membership from all 900 pages from this huge document, which is the largest text from all the association agreements ever existed. But now, if it's not the situation to explain, you all know that because of war, probably Ukraine in this summer was granted by the candidate status. We didn't start the negotiations, but now candidate status, which means that sooner or later, in certain circumstances, that would be it is possible to join the European Union. So now I'm sure that we have to start to thinking about what would be the future of Ukraine after the war. And from the international relations perspective, of course, it's a EU and NATO membership from my point of view, but EU definitely. So European integration process, it's more wider than just EU membership. We should not wait for European integration until the institutional membership. So with experts is talking about this for decades. We should start European integration without not waiting for the final signature. And the strange situation is that this war makes all this process much faster, to my point of view. It means, I would say from Ukrainian perspective first, in Ukraine, we see the dramatic changes because of war in the whole infrastructure, including this, our electricity stuff, many other things, and including the weakness of our oligarch system.
Unfortunately, we've lost Dennis as he told us that the internet there is in Odessa is a bit shaky for obvious reasons at the moment, but he will, I'm sure, return to us soon, so we can return to some of the questions he was answering there about de-oligarchization. But in the meantime, we're going to sweep northwards, or at least from where I am, to my colleague Piret Ehin in Tartu University. Now, Estonia, of course, has just overtaken Latvia, as we knew you would, as the biggest giver of economic, humanitarian, and military aid as a percentage of GDP to Ukraine. How do you think the Baltic states, Piret, have reacted to the crisis here? I mean, of course, we three, together with Poland, are amongst the biggest economic supporters, and also diplomatic supporters and political supporters. But do you think there is anything more that could have been done? Anything that could be done differently? And also, what's the perspective from the European Union from your point of view? Are they listening to the Baltic states more now than they were before? Are there some dissenting voices in there? And well, I think that's enough to be getting on with. So I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Daunis. That is a lot for 5 minutes, but absolutely, as you said, the three Baltic states have been among the most committed supporters of Ukraine, and I'm happy to say this support, both at the governmental and societal level, is still strong. This commitment to Ukrainian victory is very, very present, very strong. Like you said, together with Poland, the Baltic Three are among the top donors relative to GDP and population. Estonia's military aid to Ukraine last year amounted to 1/3 of Estonia's defense budget, and this certainly has been noted. Very strong political support, as you said. The Baltic parliaments were among the first to recognize Russia's war as genocide and have declared the Russian regime to be a terrorist regime. And leaders have insisted on tougher sanctions, complete escalation, Ukraine. So in many ways, indeed, the Baltic countries have been showing the way. They have been forerunners. I think a lot of the demands, proposals they made several months ago are now being picked up by others. And certainly in the Estonian discourse, there's an explicit recognition that we have perhaps never been as visible and as listened to in exercise as much foreign policy leadership as but I wanted to make 5 quick points about the Baltic position, Baltic approach, and sort of what I'm picking up from Baltic discourses, and maybe then in the end just one general point about the EU. What key Estonian officials keep emphasizing is that what ultimately matters when all is said and done is the outcome of this war. And the outcome determines not only Ukraine's future, but the future of the European security architecture. We need to be bold enough to say that the only acceptable outcome is a military defeat of Russia and a complete failure and discreditation of aggression as a tool. So the emphasis is not that this war should necessarily end as soon as possible, even though that's of course what we all hope. But what matters equally much is how it ends. So second, we must continue to raise the cost of aggression for Russia by all possible means. More support, more arms to Ukraine, tougher sanctions, continue to isolate Russia. The third, what I think is a sort of increasingly prominent theme in Baltic discourses are the demands for justice and accountability. We need to make sure that Russia doesn't get away with aggression, and we need to talk about trials, tribunals, punishment, and so on. The Baltic parliaments and ministers have already for many months called for a special tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And the ultimate objective is to bring Russia's top political, military, and political leadership to account. What we're seeing now is that these calls are now being echoed by officials in bigger member states, notably by Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock just this Monday. There's increased emphasis on the reconstruction effort and the realization that we really need to start planning for it. The building blocks and mechanisms for it should be set in place, and Estonia is trying to set some good examples by successful projects. For instance, building a kindergarten. My final point about Baltic discourses, although there's much more to say, I think there's a growing realization that the security outlook for the Baltic states will be grim in the foreseeable future, even regardless of how exactly the war ends. Even if Russia is defeated in Ukraine, it's going to pose a serious military threat to the Baltic states. We will be dealing with a revengeful, revanchist, aggressive Russia for the foreseeable future that will look to exploit any weaknesses. So the Baltic states really need to brace for the long term and do everything possible to boost security and build resilience. The one quick point I want to make about the EU is that the war has had a truly transformative impact. We had another Zoom seminar on these topics a few weeks ago, and I fully agree with some of the speakers there that perhaps the biggest change is that the EU has now become a truly geopolitical actor. It has taken a side, it has declared that it stands with Ukraine, and it has come to officially recognize Russia as the biggest threat to European security. So to the surprise of many, including the Kremlin, the EU has been really a relevant player in the conflict with Russia. But by saying that, I by no means want to de-emphasize the role of the United States leading the international effort. But simply the fact that the EU has had enough unity to adopt 9 sanctions packages and to Ukraine is remarkable. But the EU, of course, faces many challenges: maintaining unity, coping with the multiple crises, energy, cost of living, refugees. The EU really needs to increase its resilience against Russian attacks and influence, including all sorts of information operations, economic influence operations. The EU needs a better neighborhood policy, and it needs to get serious about enlargement. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Piret. Your microphone is still a little dodgy. We can hear you, but it gets a little fuzzy in parts. So, but we'll get back to you. Hopefully, it'll be better by then. So now we're going to go into our second round of questions. And Daunis, you disappeared from us, but you're here now. So I very much want you to perhaps there's something you want to finish off from what you were saying before, because we got as far as the oligarchs and the declining influence of the oligarchs, and then
everything shut down.
It happened very slowly. First of all, your voice disappeared, then you froze, and then you disappeared. So it was a very gradual process. But perhaps there's something you want to add about the oligarchs, and then I have a follow-up question for you.
Yeah. I think that we don't have much time to analyze all the bunch of documents of EU and Ukraine with sectoral cooperation and so on and so forth. But I am pretty sure that the oligarch economy of Ukraine will never fit to European Union economy. So it's unfortunately we need this kind of war to totally change the Ukrainian environment. So that we will join EU or not join EU. We will definitely finish our post-Soviet period of history. That will definitely be written in Book of History 1991, 2022. This is a post-Soviet Ukraine. And after the war, it would be another country. So I hope that this country will sooner or later join EU and NATO. But in any case, it is not only depends on us, but it also depends on European Union, how they will design the future enlargement. And I would say that all this system of transition period, transformation, which go through the Eastern Europe and Baltic states based on Copenhagen criteria will not work 100% for the another wave with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, if it will take place any time. So I'm sure that European Union also will have a lot of work to do, how to design for themselves the new concept of this kind of enlargement. And unfortunately, the situation of war is pushing this agenda even inside European Union. That's what I would like to say. And of course, NATO issue is also, it's more connected with the concrete situation with military. It's connected with the United States position and the concept what it would be the vision of future Ukraine, not only by Ukrainians, but also by the United States and unfortunately by China probably. So it would be, everyone should recognize that, okay, this country will be part of NATO, or it should be kind of neutral country, or we will take war in next 10 years more. We don't know this. So that's why, but anyway, during the, even before the war, after Maidan, we have a majority of population who will definitely vote for NATO and vote for EU in case this kind of referendum will take place tomorrow. That's also kind of a great historical shift. So that's it.
Thank you, Daunis. Now, I have a follow-up question to you about the Russian speakers in Ukraine, because the Ukraine war has had a deep impact on the Russian diaspora, I would say all around the world, but especially in the Baltic states, where over the last year or so, we've seen, especially Latvia, but also Estonia, undertake policies which could be called de-Russification policies. In the case of Latvia, trying to drive out Russian from the public and private sphere, politicians committing to get rid of Russian-speaking minority schools by 2025, and so on. There are new initiatives almost every month in this sphere. How do you think the Russian minority in Ukraine has responded to the war, and how will they feel after the war? And can we expect some kind of de-Russification policies in Ukraine after the war?
Yes, this kind of de-Russification is taking place even right now, but I would say there is a big difference between Baltic states, other countries, even like Western Ukrainian region, from other regions of Ukraine, especially if we will speak about returning the Crimea and Donbass. So in Eastern Ukraine and in Southern Russian-speaking population, it's not, sometimes it's a majority of populations in certain areas. And big difference from Baltic states is that Ukraine never recognized itself as a country which was occupied by Soviet Union or Russia sometimes. So from legal point of view, it was just part of Soviet Union, and there is no official documents that it was kind of occupation. And these people, Russian-speaking minority, just came to this country with the Russian militaries. We can speak about this case from East, not for the Western Ukraine, for the East and South. But very big difference is that there are a lot of millions of people in Ukraine who are Russian speakers, who are bilingual, most like in Kyiv, central Ukraine. But it doesn't mean that they identify themselves with Russian Federation, especially in current situation. That's, I think it was one of the mistake from Putin administration and for himself personally, that they start to believe in their Russian propaganda, Moscow propaganda, that those people who live in Ukraine who speak Russian language in their families, that they politically are supporting the idea of reunification of so-called Soviet Union or Russian, big Russia somehow, Russian world. It is not absolutely like that. And this is the exact situation in Odessa, where majority people are speaking Russian language all their life, but it doesn't mean at all that we are somehow respecting the idea of so-called Russian world, we should join the big Russia sooner or later. That's I would say that it's I will say soft way. It's a big mistake from the Russian Federation to think about us this way. Of course, there are some people who would welcome Russian army, but they keep quiet, and I'm sure it is very difficult to identify them by any sociological research. But I would predict that it's not a big percentage right now. So I believe that Ukraine will build a kind of a multicultural nation, of course, with the Ukrainian language as a state language. And now I see even in Odessa, more and more people switch to Ukrainian language. Yeah, so we do this. And of course, we teach in Ukrainian language before in the university. Even we speak Russian between ourselves, but now we start to speak even Ukrainian way between ourselves in breaks between lecture, which is kind of a new thing. This aim was in Kyiv in 90s. I would say I asked my Kyiv colleague, not Lviv, they were always speak only Ukrainian, Western Ukraine. But I asked my Kyiv colleague, when you switch to Ukrainian, yeah, during the 90s, they just switched, and for them, it's easy to speak in Ukrainian language on their professional political science and AR sphere, English and Ukrainian. So we go this right now, this period. So of course it's easy to teach Ukrainian language, but now it's a kind of a real Ukrainization. But of course there are many things, many discussions about that, but I would prefer not to discuss hardly about that during the war. I think that we will start speaking after the victory about the rights of Russian language and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Denis, for that. And speaking of the post-war and a victory, and I'll now turn to Yuliya. And Yuliya, after the war, the reconstruction process, which will be funded largely by EU, US, and other international donor cash, offers an absolutely unique opportunity to fundamentally modernize Ukrainian infrastructure, institutions, and also offers certain societal opportunities as well. What do you think should be the focus of this post-war reconstruction? Because, of course, while the amounts of money of which we've been speaking, I think €1 trillion now is the accepted amount that will be invested, not all demands will be met. But what do you think would be the priorities for the post-war reconstruction process?
Yeah, many thanks for addressing this question for me, but I also want to add very briefly regarding the lingual wars in Ukraine, because originally I'm from region, from the actually eastern region, and from the city located only 40 kilometers from the Russian border. And actually I should recognize that in late 90s and early 2000s, there were actually some, I would say, pressure on Ukrainian language there, because to be true, I was raised in Russian-speaking environment, and actually I was speaking Russian with my mom and Ukrainian with my dad, but my school education was totally made in Russian. And there are also numerous courses in universities were also were teaching in Russia. So that was kind of a problem, how to prioritize Ukrainian there. And I would say that Ukrainian speakers find problematic to express themselves, at least before 2014, in public sphere. When in Eastern Ukraine, a lot of people switch into Ukrainian, because probably in our region, people have the vaccine against the Russian world better, facing with the aftermath of Donbass conflict, and knowing thousands of IDPs and refugees who came from this region, namely to Kharkiv region. But about the reconstruction of Ukraine, I would like to say here that definitely you're totally correct here, that probably it will be the unique experience which can be based on the previous experience of, let's say, former Yugoslavia reconstruction, or let's say some reconstruction already made by the international institutions in war and conflict zone in Asia and Africa. And definitely here we considering the European Union taken in general as a prior partners, but also we are rely on other partners like United States of America, Turkey, and separate member states of the EU. They already developed a kind of reconstruction plan, and I really was proud to take a personal part in Lugano conference, which was devoted totally to this further recovery of Ukraine. So you can see, you can check the website of the conference and can compare the plan provided by national government of Ukraine and actually the vision of civil society and expert community. There are several, I would say, equally important parts or directions of this reconstruction. I would mention here of course, regarding the latest developments, there should be the green energy and reconstruction of energy sector of Ukraine. The other will address humanitarian needs, because we have more than 160,000 of residential building already destroyed, and housing in Ukraine is still a great problem. We have more than 2,000 and half educational buildings which are totally destroyed in Ukraine, and actually except this infrastructural reconstruction, there will be some economical issues to be addressed. Denis mentioned the oligarchization of Ukraine. I actually addressed this efforts and reforms which were implemented a little bit prior to war, but definitely some economical areas should be prioritized, like agricultural sector, because Ukraine is well known as a breadbasket of Europe, and probably not Europe as such, taking apart. And of course, it could be creative economy and IT sphere, which was pretty developed before the war, and during the first, I would say, 6 months of the war, it was kind of a great engine for Ukrainian economy, which showed the high rate of resilience, and actually kind of fueled other parts of Ukrainian economy. So the main questions here is not only the areas which should be prioritized, but actually how to design these bodies which will be responsible for reconstructions and recovery process in Ukraine. And according to vision of expert community and civil society, there should be like 3 main partners which could be equally involved, at least in consultation processes. It should be European Union and international donors. It should be national and, which is very important, local government, and actually there will be a civil society, and within this triangle, these decision-making actions and monitor processes should be implemented. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yuliya. We're going to go over to Piret now, and then we're going to go to the Q&A session with the questions that have been submitted by the audience, and thank you for that. We won't be able to address all of them, but we'll try to get through as many as we can. And Piret, I really have just one question for you, so we can try to keep it quite short so we can go to the Q&A, which is, what do you think is a reasonable time frame for Ukrainian membership of the European Union after hostilities have ceased, presuming that the hostilities cease in a reasonably timely manner? You know, bearing in mind that it took the Baltic states 13 years from the collapse of the Soviet Union to membership. How do you see this perspective playing out for Ukraine?
I actually do not dare to predict that. I think the big question is, will there be some sort of fast track process for Ukraine's accession? Will Ukraine get special treatment? And the signals are really sort of mixed and not clear. So the EU gave candidate status to Ukraine, and by doing so exceeded the expectations of many. But it also outlined conditions that Ukraine has to meet, the so-called 7 recommendations. In December, the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament claimed that Ukraine has adopted the necessary legislation. And now the question is, when will the EU offer its assessment and define the next steps? And the deadlines or the EU's plans regarding when it will do that have changed a number of times. And we are also all waiting for the Commission's big technical assessment of how well Ukraine's legislation is aligned with the EU acquis. So in that sense, it's very difficult to predict right now. I think I'll limit it to that. I know limited time.
Thank you, Piret. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the fast track has taken place for wealthy countries before, you know, the Nordic accessions in the 1990s, but this would be a different type of fast track if it was to take place. So now we go into our questions from the audience, and there's a group of them that have been put together for me, and this first clutch of questions is for Yuliya, first of all, and then for Daunis. We have some special questions for Piret. So Yuliya and Daunis, so some of our listeners write that, do you think there is a possibility that Ukrainian society becomes polarized after the war because of the different dispositions and perceptions of historical and contemporary events that its citizens held before the war, such as on the 2014 protests, the Maidan, Ukrainian independence, foreign policy direction, and so on? So in other words, you know, will there be a more unified Ukraine, or will it be sort of business as usual in a sense, do you think, after the war? Second question, and you can feel free to pick which ones of these you want to tackle, is do you think that centralization has already succeeded in creating national unity? And thirdly, has the war had an impact on Russian disinformation campaigns? Presumably meaning the grip that they have, the influence that they have on citizens. So Yuliya, we'll turn to you first, and then Daunis. And if you could do this in a couple of minutes, that would be great.
I would like to thank our audience for these very sophisticated questions, and probably every of that deserves the particular roundtable to discuss. But thank you. About depolarization and civic cohesion, which we can trace now in Ukraine. Well, as a political scientist, I asking myself which types of threats we can face with after the war in Ukraine, and probably some kind of new divisions in Ukrainian society definitely will be on table, and can cause the post-war populism, which I literally try to be aware about. But there are not a polarization, especially which could be grounded on the set of indicators which were pointed out in the question, because now we have this situation when the more than 84% of Ukrainian, even in eastern and southern part of Ukraine, see their future in the European Union. So geopolitical choices are not the issue anymore, and addressing the let's say lingual divisions which were presented like cleavages before, more than 80% of Ukrainians consider that Ukrainian language should be used on public level as a one, let's say, state official language. So it is not a purpose for people at the moment which language do they use in the everyday communications, but people have this unity regarding the European democratic future of Ukraine, and regarding the probably the official rules which should be implemented. And about the Russia propaganda and or disinformation campaigns, why they weren't so efficient as they were in 2014, let's say. I remember the first day of war. Actually, I experienced these awful sounds of explosions just in a neighborhood in Kharkiv, and I couldn't help but notice that during this first morning of full-scale invasion, Russia tried to attack television stations in numerous Ukrainian cities, including Kharkiv, Kyiv, Rivne, Kramatorsk, Korostin. So all all over the world, they try to target the television stations. And that is also the indicator of how Russia miscalculated Ukraine, because actually since 2020, majority of Ukrainians, they get their information and news from internet sources. Not all of them are reliable, of course, but still we have a very different types of informational consumptions in Ukraine comparatively to Russia, where they totally depend on television news. Moreover, I would say that corona pandemic was some way helpful here, because during the pandemic, numerous civic society organizations and even the Ministry of Digital Transformation, they provided free courses in disinformation. They worked with people and trained them how to recognize fake news, how to react on doubtful news, and so on and so forth. So before the war, about 74% of Ukrainians, they declared that they are able to recognize disinformation or fake news. So people were more or less aware about that. And I would add here that starting that since 2017, some of Russian media were banned in Ukraine. And here we can see some positive effects, because being a liberal myself, I still think that this decision probably was correct to ban Russian official media and some social networks like Odnoklassniki and Vkontakte. And the last question was about
well, I think we can skip the last question. We'll go to Daunis, because we're beginning to run a little short of time. So Daunis, over to you.
Yeah, I'll try to be short, and I'm not a politician. I can say that the question of depolarization will depend on how the real map of Ukraine will look like after the victory. I really hope and I believe that this map will be in the same like it was in 1991. But in reality, we can see that all the current polls, yes, we have 84% who will support of our European way, but now the people who live in Crimea and those who live now in Donetsk and Lugansk, they are not taking part in these polls. And we don't know how we will work with these people after the war. That's an absolutely different issue. And about the depolarization, I would say that, of course, there are real historical background of this polarization, different historic background of Western Ukraine with Poland and Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Eastern Ukraine with a more period in Soviet Union and 100 years in Russian Empire. But in the same time, this polarization inside Ukraine have a very big artificial roots as well. It was designed by purpose starting through 2004 with orange and blue part of Ukraine, and it was pushed all the time. In 90s, there was not such a situation, because it was much more tolerant attitude towards absolutely different points of view on Ukrainian history and Ukrainian language, state language, and so on. So in 90s, beginning in 2000, there was like Bandera monument in Lviv, and Catherine II monument was raised in Odessa, which was destroyed this month. So, and no one really have a conflict about that. So when we came to each other, yeah, it was strange to see the glorification of Ukrainian nationalism from eastern part, but there was no real conflict. This conflict was pushed by the pro-Russian political movements like President Yanukovych and his circles. Even they use a real historical background, of course. So I'm sure that the successful Ukrainian state in Europe should be multicultural, of course, based on Ukrainian state language, Ukrainian culture as a main one, but don't using the 19th century way of nationalism politics, which will not simply work. So that's But I would prefer, I mentioned this as well, to start all the discussion after the war. Now it is not time for, we should be absolutely tough about anything which can push a Russian agenda inside Ukrainian state.
Okay, thank you, Daunis. And Piret, to you then. A question asks, before the war, Ukraine was taking some lessons from the Baltics in terms of dealing with corruption, democracy reforms, and modernizing the economy. How do you see this continuing or perhaps changing after the war ends?
Thank you. If the question is if there are still lessons to learn for Ukraine from the Baltic experience, then I think absolutely yes. And one area where the Baltic experience I think will be very useful and has already been very useful for Ukraine is precisely how to deal with the EU, how the accession process works. By the way, next year will be the 20th anniversary of Baltic and Eastern European membership in the EU, and I'm sure that specifically in May there will be many conferences and events dedicated to taking stock and outlining the lessons learned. And I really hope that a lot of experience sharing with Ukraine, but also Moldova and Georgia will happen, and some of it is certainly already going on. Thanks.
Thank you, Piret. Okay, so my final questions to Yuliya and Daunis are quite simple. I mean, we the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, we're a scholarly organization bringing together scholars, students, interested individual scholars from all around the world with an interest in Baltic politics. And we, in our universities and elsewhere, we've given a lot of thought to how we can support scholars and universities as institutions over the next weeks, over the next months, hopefully not in terms of war, over the next years. And so from your perspectives, what is it that we, our audience participating now, maybe watching the webinar later, what is it that we could do to assist our colleagues in academia in Ukraine? And Daunis, perhaps I'll start with you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Of course, we really appreciate all the support is coming from United States and European Union countries. And it's easy to general answer. It's a more and more joint projects with Ukrainian scholars and Ukrainian universities. The biggest challenge is not only the individual support of Ukrainian scholars, especially to those who can move to Europe or States, but for those who are staying in Ukraine. Even like myself, I mostly stay in Ukraine, but I used to be in States and Europe before and come back to Odessa and so on. But it's very important to keep the Ukrainian university as just alive. Especially, I know how dramatic situation is in Kharkiv University, where a couple buildings was just destroyed. In Odessa, it is not the case, but it's a huge, like economical challenge, how we will just keep all these buildings, the electricity, heating, and so on and so forth. So this kind of institutional projects and supports of existing students and especially young scholars, PhD students, who are preferring to not break the connections with their Ukrainian universities. Not only, of course, for those who are active, there's not a lot of opportunities in Europe now or in North America, but concrete partnership with institutional projects, I would prefer much more, I would say, to my taste.
Thank you. And Yuliya?
Yeah, thank you, Denise, for mentioning Karazin University. Definitely, Karazin University, which always was in top 5 of Ukrainian university and probably was the largest educational center for the Eastern Ukraine and actually for Donbass region as well. We have 3 buildings totally destroyed, which can be even repaired at the moment. And but the physical reconstruction also a point here, and we also hope that new buildings for Ukrainian educational organization could be provided within this broad recovery process in post-war Ukraine. But still, I literally would like to apply it to colleagues that we can also make kind of input with involving Ukrainian scholars in conversation. I faced myself sometimes when there are a lot of talks about Ukraine without any Ukrainian around, especially so decolonization of the area studies, I mean Russia and Eurasian studies. We need here to combine our efforts, and probably it's unique chance to make some significant changes and prioritize even Baltic studies or Ukrainian studies or other aspects of European studies or regional studies which were under the Russian topic dominance for decades. And the third, I would say, what is important here, of course, as a guarantor for master programs, who is responsible for the quality of education, for working with students, I can see that brain drain probably will be the most important factor of Ukrainian post-war reconstruction. So I literally appreciate any Western institutions which host Ukrainian students and colleagues and scholars, but still let's acknowledge that Ukrainian now experience probably the hugest losses of human capital. So it's very important, not only to host people who are suffering or fled from war, but make them return with a better quality of, I would say, knowledge, experience, skills, and so on and so forth. So in that extent, probably what Denise already said, that we would be more interested in joint programs, in joint projects, and joint research that just kind of a charity, temporary charity with hosting Ukrainian students or professors. So that is a point. So let's make it sustainable, and more efficient in a way.
Thank you, Yuliya. And Piret, I mean, we are the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. So I've got to ask you a question about Estonian elections coming up. Is there a threat that there might be a political change and some sort of change in support to Ukraine after the election?
The two main rivals in this election are the Reform Party and EKRE, the radical right populist party. And indeed, EKRE's positions on Ukraine and on Ukrainian refugees are not the ones that sort of the mainstream Estonia society shares, as confirmed by various survey studies. But EKRE is trying to appeal to discontented voters and also increasingly to Russian speakers. And that's an interesting development, that a nationalist party is increasingly appealing to Russian speakers and is playing up the various crisis situations, the cost of living crisis, energy crisis, and the refugee crisis. So yes, we have a bit of a new situation in the country, but at the same time, support for the Reform Party is strong, and certainly there's a lot of support for Kaja Kallas, the current Prime Minister, who has been one of the most outspoken leaders in Eastern Europe in terms of support for Ukraine.
Thank you, Piret. And with that, we wrap up our webinar today. I'd like to say a big thank you on behalf of myself and AABS to Yuliya, to Daunis, and to Piret for taking the time to join us in the webinar and for your insights into the situation. As Dovilė, our president, said at the start of the webinar, this is our fourth webinar over the last year, and I'm quite confident that soon there will be a fifth, and I hope that the participants who joined us today and who are watching us later on over different media will join us then as well. So to all, thank you.